Some of the sociologists and anthropologists, such as Karl Mannheim, Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, Jeffrey Gorer, Ruth Landis, to mention a few at random, have presented approaches which would justify explanations of history in a way useful to propaganda students, but they have not yet persuaded the historians to do the work. End footnote. A history of propaganda would provide not only a new light on many otherwise odd or trivial historical events, it would throw genuine illumination on the process of history itself. There are, however, numerous instances which to show applications of psychological warfare. The use of panic by Gideon. One of the earliest, by traditional reckoning 1245 BC, applications was Gideon's use of the lamps and pitchers in the great battle against the Midianites. The story is told in the 7th chapter of the book of Judges. Gideon was in a tactically poor position. The Midianites outnumbered him and were on the verge of smiting him very thoroughly. Ordinary combat methods could not solve the situation, so Gideon, acting upon more exalted inspiration than is usually vouchsafed to modern commanders, took the technology and military formality of his time into account. Retaining 300 selected men, he sought for some device which would cause real confusion in the enemy host. He knew well that the tactics of his time called for every century of men to have one light carrier and one torchbearer for the group. By equipping 300 men with a torch and a trumpet each, he could create the effect of 30,000. Since the lights could not be turned on and off with switches, like ours, the pitchers concealed them, thus achieving the effect of suddenness. He had his 300 men equipped with lamps and pitchers. The lamps were concealed in the pitchers, each man carrying one, along with a trumpet. He lined his forces in appropriate disposition around the enemy camp at night, and had them, himself setting the example, break the pitchers while blowing like mad on the trumpets. The Midianites were startled out of their sleep and their wits. They fought one another throughout their own camp. The Hebrew chronicler modestly gives credit for this to the Lord. Then the Midianites gave up altogether and fled, and the men of Israel pursued after the Midianites. That settled the Midianite problem for a while. Later, Gideon finished Midian altogether. This type of psychological warfare device, the use of unfamiliar instruments to excite panic, is common in the history of all ancient countries. In China, the emperor-usurper Wang Mang on one occasion tried to destroy the Hunnish tribes with an army that included heavy detachments of military sorcerers, even though the Han military emperor had found orthodox methods the most reliable. Wang Mang got whipped at this, but he was an incurable innovator, and in 23 AD, while trying to put down some highly successful rebels, he collected all the animals out of the imperial menagerie and sent them along to scare the enemy. Tigers, rhinoceros, and elephants were included. The rebels hit first, killing the imperial general Wang Sun.
Okay.
I think the imperial army, where they panicked the men. A hurricane, which happened to be raging at the same time, enhanced the excitement. Not only were the imperial troops defeated, but the military propaganda of the rebels was so jubilant in tone and so successful in effect that the standard propaganda theme, depress and unnerve the enemy commander, was fulfilled almost to excess on Wang Mang. Here is what happened to him after he noted the progress of the enemy. Quote, "A profound melancholy fell upon the emperor. It undermined his health. He drank to excess, ate nothing but oysters, and let everything happen by chance. Unable to stretch out, he slept sitting up on a bench." End quote. Wang Mang was killed in the same year, and China remained without another economic New Deal until the time of Wang Anshi, AD 1021 to 1086, 1,000 years later. Better psychological warfare would have changed history. A more successful application of psychological warfare is recorded in the writings of Herodotus, the Greek historian. Quote, "Themistocles, having selected the best sailing ships of the Athenians, went to the place where there was water fit for drinking, and engraved upon the stones inscriptions, which the Ionians, upon arriving the next day at Artemisium, read. The inscriptions were to this effect: Men of Ionia, you do wrong in fighting against your fathers and helping to enslave Greece. Rather, therefore, come over to us, or if you cannot do that, withdraw your forces from the contest and entreat the Carians to do the same. But if neither of these things is possible, and you are bound by too strong a necessity, Footnote: the author's attention to this reference was drawn by an unpublished, undated typescript article in the War Department files by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel T. Mackall, infantry. End footnote. This text is very much like leaflet structure in World War II among reluctant enemies, such as the Italians, the Japanese public troops, and others. Compare this with text with Figure 5. Note that the propagandist tries to see things from the viewpoint of his audience, his errant he lays the beginning of another line, the propaganda to the Persians, quote, black propaganda, making the Persians think that any Ionian who was less than perfect was a secret Athenian sympathizer. The appeal is sound by all modern standards of the combat leader. Another type of early military propaganda was the political denunciation which, issued at the beginning of war, could be cited from then on as legal and ethical justification for one side or the other. In the Chinese Sanhua, which is probably been read by more human beings than any other work of fiction, there is preserved the alleged text of the proclamation by a group of loyalist pro-Han rebels on the eve of military operations, about AD 200. The text is interesting because it combines the following techniques, all of them sound. 1. Naming the specific enemy. 2. Appeal to the quote, 3. Sympathy for the common people. 4. Claim of support for the legitimate government. 5. Affirmation of one's own strength and high morale. 6. Invocation of unity. 7. Appeal to religion. The issuance of the proclamation was connected with rather elaborate formal ceremony. The House of Han has fallen upon evil players. The bonds of imperial authority unloosened. The rebel minister, Tang Shou, takes advantage of the distress of both evil and calamity falls upon honorable hands. Cruelty handled by a simple foe. We, Shao and his confederates, fearing for the safety of the imperial prerogatives, have assembled military forces to rescue the state. We now pledge ourselves to exert our whole strength and to act in concord with the utmost limits of our powers. There must be no disconcerted or selfish action. Should any depart from this pledge, may he lose his life and leave no posterity. Almighty, eminent, universal Mother Earth, and the enlightened spirits of our forefathers, be ye our witnesses. End quote. Any history of any country will yield further examples of this kind of material. Whenever it is consciously used as an adjunct to military operations, it may appropriately be termed military propaganda. Emphasis on ideology. In a sense, the experience of the past may unfortunately provide a clue to the future. The last two great wars have shown an increasing emphasis on ideology or political faith, see definition page 30 below, as driving forces behind warfare rather than the considerations of coldly calculated diplomacy. Wars become more serious and less gentlemanly. The enemy must be taken into account not merely as a man, but as a fanatic. To the normal group loyalty of any good soldier to his army, right or wrong, there is added the loyalty to the ism, or the leader. Warfare thus goes back to the wars of faith. It is possible that techniques from the Christian Mohammedan or from the Protestant Catholic wars of the past could be re-examined with a view to establishing those parts of their tested experience which may seem to be psychologically and militarily sound in our own time. How fast can converts be made from the other side? In what circumstances should an enemy word of honor be treated as valid? How can heretics, today read subversive elements, be uprooted? Does the enemy faith have weak points which permit enemy beliefs to be turned against personnel at the appropriate times? What unintentional reforms should the victims of the Holocaust follow in mentioning subjects which are reverenced by the enemy, but not by themselves? The expansion of the Islamic faith provides a great deal of procedural information which cannot be neglected in our time. It has faith should not be destroyed by violence, and that force alone is insufficient to change the minds of men. If this were true, it would mean that Germany can never be denazified, and that the democratic peoples captured by totalitarian powers can adjust themselves to their new overlords, or, if adjusted, can be converted back to free principles. In reality, warfare by Mohammed's captains and successors demonstrated two principles of long-range psychological warfare, which are still valid today. A people can be converted from one faith to the other if given the choice between conversion and extermination, stubborn individuals being rooted out. To effect the initial conversion, Participation in the public ceremonies and formal language of the new faith
Oh,
must be required. Sustained counterintelligence must remain on the alert against backsliders, but formal acceptance will become genuine acceptance if all public media of expression are denied the vanquished faith. If immediate wholesale conversion would require military operations that were too extensive or severe, the same result can be effected by toleration of the ejection of faith, combined with the issuance of genuine privileges to the new preferred faith. The conquered people are left in the private, humble enjoyment of their old beliefs and customs, but while participation in public life, whether political, cultural, or economic, is conditioned on acceptance of the new faith. In this manner, all uprising members of society will move in a few generations toward a different faith in the process of becoming rich, powerful, and honored. What is left of the old faith will be a gutter superstition, possessing neither power nor majesty. These two rules worked once in the rise of Islam. They were applied again by Nazi overlords during World War II, the former in Poland, the Ukraine, and now Russia, the latter in Holland, Belgium, Norway, and other Western countries. The rules will probably be seen in action again. The former process is difficult and bloody but quick. The latter is as sure as a steamroller. If Christians or Democrats or progressives, whatever breed them may fall, are put in a position of underprivilege and shame for their beliefs, and if the door is left open to voluntary conversion, so that anyone who wants to can go ahead and become Messiah, the way Ted Wilson argued for years will be established by anyone who can make a profit. In the language of Vilfredo Pareto, this will probably be termed capture of the rise of religion. In the language of Matthew Archer, this will be described as removing leadership cadres from historically superseded classes. In the language of practical science, it means cut in the smart boys from the opposition so that they can't set up a racket of their own. Figure 1, a basic form of propaganda. This American leaflet, issued during the Philippine landings, was dropped on inhabited Philippine areas in order to obtain local civilian cooperation with the landing forces. It can be called the civilian action type. End of figure 1. Figure 2, Nazi leaflet.
Okay.
In this leaflet used on the Italian front in 1944, the Nazis did not call for any specific action. It was merely depression of American morale for future exploitation by action propaganda. Note the extreme simplicity of the message. Throughout World War II, the Nazis were misled by their own tendentious political intelligence reports and consequently overestimated the kind and degree of American opposition to Franklin D. Roosevelt. They mistook normal complaint for treasonable sedition. Hence, leaflets such as this. End of figure 2. Figure 3, one of the outstanding leaflets of the war. Prepared in 1945 for distribution by B-29s operating over Japan, this leaflet lists 11 Japanese cities which were marked for destruction. The leaflet is apparently of the civilian action type, calling on Japanese civilians to save their own lives. At the same time, it had the effect of shutting down 11 strategically important cities, thus hurting the Japanese war effort, while giving the Americans a reputation for humanity and also refuting enemy charges that we undertook indiscriminate bombing. End of figure 3. Figure 4, the pass which brought them in. Germans liked things done in an official, formal manner, even in the midst of chaos, catastrophe, and defeat. The Allies obliged and gave the Germans various forms of very official-looking surrender passes, of which this is one. The original is printed in red and has banknote-type engraving, which makes it resemble a soap premium coupon. 1944 to 45, issued by Schaeff. End of figure 4. Figure 5, revolutionary propaganda. When revolution favors one side or the other in war, revolutionary propaganda becomes an instrument which is used by one constituted government against another. This leaflet was issued by the Azad Hind Fauj, Free India Army, of the Japanese puppet Subhas Chandra Bose, Singapore, then called Shonan, 1943 and 1944. The leaflet avoids direct reference to and is therefore bloc propaganda. Its theme is simple. The British are alleged to eat while the Hindus starve. At the time, this argument had some plausibility. There was famine in Bengal, but no white men were found among the thousands of emaciated dead. End of figure 5. Figure 6, propaganda for illiterates. Propaganda reached out for the mass audience in World War II. Some of the most interesting developments in this line were undertaken by CBI theater facilities and their Japanese competitors. The leaflet shown above is designed to tell its
Okay.
story in Hindustani Devanagari script or in Ramanathan style to Indians who could read either form, and with pictures to the illiterates. It starts with the Gideon's anthem and ends with the Congress flag used by the puppet protégés who were leader Subhash Chandra Bose. End of figure 6. Figure 7, propaganda through news. News is one of the best mirrors of psychological warfare to the enemy. One of the newspapers was directed by the Allies to the German troops in the Aegean Islands, the other by the Germans to the American fighters. Of the two, the Allied paper in German is the more professional job. Note the separation of appeals from the news, the greater newsiness of the news columns, and the explanation provided for truth bombs to they use in their own Greek language, translated. End of figure 7. End of section 1. Read by Eli Bishop.
Section 2 of Psychological Warfare. Read by Brandon Mitchell. Psychological Warfare by Paul M.A. Linebarger. Chapter 1b, Historic Examples of Psychological Warfare, Part 2. The Black Propaganda of Genghis Khan. Another demonstration of psychological warfare in the past was so effective that its results linger to this day. It is commonly thought that the greatest conqueror the world has ever seen, Temujin, the Genghis Khan, effected his Mongol conquest with limitless hordes of wild Tartar horsemen who flooded the world by weight of sheer numbers. Recent research shows that the sparsely settled countryside of Inner Asia could not have produced populations heavy enough to overwhelm the densely settled areas of the great Mongol periphery by weight alone. Was built on bold military inventiveness, the use of highly mobile forces, the full use of intelligence, the coordination of half-global strategy, the application of propaganda in all its forms. The Mongols were fighting the Sung dynasty in China and the Holy Roman Empire in Prussia 4,000 miles apart when neither of their adversaries knew, in more than rumor, that the other existed. The Mongols used espionage to plan their campaigns and deliberately used rumor and other means to exaggerate huge numbers, stupidity, and ferocity. They did not care what their enemies thought as long as the enemies became frightened. Europeans described light, hard-hitting, numerically inferior cavalry as a numberless horde because Mongol agents whispered such a story in the streets. To this day, most Europeans do not appreciate the lightness of the forces nor the cold intelligence of command with which the Mongols hit them 7 centuries ago. Genghis even used spies of the enemy as a means of frightening the enemy. When spies were at hand, he indoctrinated them with rumors concerning his own forces. Let the first European biographer of Genghis tell, in his own now quaint words, how Genghis put the bee on Khorzum. And a historian, to describe their strength and number, makes the spies whom the king of Khwarezmi had sent to view them speak thus. They are, say they to the Sultan, all complete men, vigorous and look like wrestlers. They breathe nothing but war and blood, and show so great an impatience to fight that the generals can scarce moderate it. Yet though they appear thus fiery, they keep themselves within the bounds of a strict, obedient command, and are entirely devoted to their prince. They are contented with any sort of food, and are not curious in the choice of beasts to eat like Mussulmen, Mohammedans, so that they are subsist without much trouble, and they not only eat swine's flesh, but feed upon wolves, bears, and dogs when they have no other meat, making no distinction between what was lawful to eat and what was forbidden, and the necessity for supporting life takes them all the dislike which the Mohammedans have for many sorts of animals. As to their number, they concluded, Genghis and troops seemed like the grasshoppers, impossible to be numbered. In reality, this prince, making a review of his army, found it to consist of 700,000 men. Enemy espionage can now, as formerly, prove useful if the net effect of it is to lower enemy morale. The ruler and people of Khorzum put up a terrific fight nonetheless, despite their expectation of being attacked by wolf-eating wrestlers without number, but they left the initiative to Genghis's hands and were doomed. However good the Mongols were in strategic and tactical propaganda, they never solved the problem of consolidation propaganda. They did not win the real loyalty of the peoples whom they conquered, unlike the Chinese, who replaced conquered populations with their own people, or the Mohammedans, who converted conquered peoples. The Mongols simply maintained law and order, collected taxes, and governed the world for a few generations. Then their world stirred beneath them, and they were gone.
Oh.
The blindness of John Milton. Moving across the centuries, for an example, it is interesting to note that John Milton, author of Paradise Lost and of other priceless books of the English-speaking world, went blind because he was so busy conducting Oliver Cromwell's psychological warfare that he disregarded the doctor's warning and abused his ailing sight. And the sad thing about it was that it was not very good psychological warfare. Milton fell into the common booby trap of refuting his opponents item by item, thus leaving them the strong affirmative position instead of providing a positive and teachable statement of his own faith. He was Latin secretary to the council in that Commonwealth of England, which was, to its contemporaries in Europe, such a novel, dreadful, and seditious form of government. The English had killed their king by somewhat offhanded legal procedures and had gone under the Cromwellian dictatorship. It was possible for their opponents to attack them from two sides at once. Believers in monarchy could call the English murderous king killers, a charge as serious in those times as the charge of anarchism or free love in this. Believers in order and liberty could call the British slaves of a tyrant. A Frenchman called Claude de Samaye, in Latin form Samisius, wrote a highly critical book about the English, and Milton seems to have lost his temper and his judgment. In his two books against Salmasius, Milton then committed almost every mistake in the whole schedule of psychological warfare. He moved from his own ground of argument over to the enemy's. He wrote at excessive length. He indulged in some of the nastiest name-calling to be found in literature and went into considerable detail to describe Salmasius in unattractive terms. He slung mud wherever he could. The books are read today under compulsion by PhD candidates, but no one else is known to find them attractive. It is not possible to find that these books had any lasting influence in their own time. This text written by Milton in Latin, but now available in English, can find extensive additions to their vocabulary. Milton turned to disappointment in poetry. The world is the gainer. The vocabulary of 17th century propaganda had a strident tone, which is, perhaps unfortunately, getting to be characteristic of the 20th century. The following epithets sound like an American Legion description of communists or a communist description of the Polish Democrats, yet they were applied in a book by a Lutheran to Quakers. The title of the tirade reads Empire, a description of the new Quakers, making known the sum of their manifold, blasphemous opinions, dangerous practices, godless crimes, attempts to subvert civil government in the churches and in the community life of the world, together with their idiotic games, their laughable action and behavior, which is enough to make sober Christian persons breathless, and which is like death, and which can display the lazy, stinking cadaver of their fanatical doctrines. In its first few pages, the book accuses the Quakers of obscenity, adultery, civil commotion, conspiracy, blasphemy, subversion, and lunacy. Milton was not out of fashion in applying bad manners to propaganda. It is merely regrettable that he did not transcend the frailties of his time. Other instances from history. Innumerable other instances of propaganda in warfare and diplomacy could be culled out of history. These would not mean much if they were presented as mere storytelling. The cultural factors would have to be figured out, the military situation would need to be appraised in realistic terms, the media available for psychological warfare would have to be charted pretty carefully before the instances would become usable examples. Here are some of the most promising topics. Naval psychological warfare techniques used by the Caribbean pirates who unnerved prospective victims. Cortez's use of horses as psychological disseminators of terror among the Aztecs, along with his exploration of Mexican legends concerning the fair god. The failure of Turkish psychological warfare in the great campaigns of 1683, which left the issue one of purely physical means and cost Turkey the possible hegemony of Central Europe. The propaganda methods of the British East India Company in the conquest of India against the overwhelming Indian numerical superiority. Edmund Taylor mentions these in his Richer by Asia. The preventative psychological warfare system set up by the Tokugawa shoguns after 1636, which bottled up the brains of the Japanese through more rigorous control than has ever been established elsewhere over civilized people. The field psychological warfare of the Manchus, who conquered China against odds running as much as 400 to 1 against them, and who used terror as a means of nullifying Chinese superiority. The propaganda of the European feudal classes against the peasant revolts, which identified the peasants with filth, anarchy, murder, and cruelty. The Inquisition, considered as a psychological warfare facility of the Spanish Empire, the agitational practices of the French revolutionaries, early uses of rockets and balloons for psychological effect, the beginnings of leaflet printing as an adjunct to field operations. Such a list just begins to touch on subjects which can and should be investigated either as staff studies or by civilian historians. Collection of the materials and framing of sound doctrines for psychological warfare are no minor task. The American Revolution. In the American Revolution, psychological warfare played a very important role. The Whig campaign of propaganda which led up to colonial defiance of Britain was energetic and expert in character, and the very opening of hostilities was marked by passionate appeals to the civilian population in the form of handbills. The American forces at the Battle of Bunker Hill used one of the earliest versions of frontline combat propaganda. The appeal was as direct as could be wished. Artful use was made of the sharp class distinctions then existing between British officers and enlisted men. Fear was exploited as an aid to persuasion. The language was pointed. Even in our own time, the Bunker Hill propaganda leaflet stands as a classic example of how to do good field propaganda. The Americans made extensive use of the press. When the newspaper proprietors veered too far to the loyalist side, they were warned to keep a more patriotic line. If, in the face of counter-threats from the loyalists, the newspaper threatened going out of business altogether, it was warned that suspension of publication would be taken as treason to America. The Whigs, before hostilities, and their successors, the patriots of the war period, showed a keen interest in keeping the press going and in making sure that their side of the story got out and got circulated rapidly. In intimidation and control of the press, they far outdistanced the British, whose papers circulated chiefly within the big cities held as British citadels throughout the war. Political reasoning, economic arguments, allegations concerning the course of the war, and atrocity stories all played a role. George Washington himself, as commander of the Continental Forces, showed a keen interest in war propaganda, and in his just, moderate political and military measures provided a policy base from which patriot propagandists could operate. Some wars are profoundly affected by a book written on one side or the other. The American Revolutionary War was one of these. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, issued as a widely sold series of pamphlets, swept American opinion like wildfire. It stated some of the fundamentals of American thinking and put its bold but reasonable revolutionary case in such simple terms that even conservatives in the Patriot group could not resist using it for propaganda purposes. Common Sense has become a classic of American literature, but it has its place in history too as the book that won the war. Other pamphleteers, with the redoubtable Sam Adams in the lead, also did well. American experience in the Mexican War was less glorious. The Mexicans waged psychological warfare against us with considerable effect, ending up with traitor American artillerymen dealing out heavy murder to the American troops outside Mexico City. Historians in both countries gloss over the treason and subversion which occurred on each side. In the Civil War, psychological warfare was practiced by both Lincoln and the Confederacy in establishing propaganda instrumentalities in England and on the groups did not become the major propaganda issue it might have because of the community of feeling on the two sides, indecision on each side as to the purpose of the war, apart from the basic issue of union or disunion, and the persistence of politics as usual, both north and south of the battle line. Boers and Burmese. In the latter part of the 19th century, two sets of British wars indicate the effect psychological warfare can play. The British conquered both Burma and the Boers. The Burmese were more numerous, had the larger country, and, if they had leadership comparable to the Japanese leadership of the time, could have developed a larger military potential. But Burma was conquered by the British in a final war which went on quietly and ingloriously. No nation came to their aid. They did not even get a chance to surrender. The British simply ended the war in the middle by announcing the end of the Burmese government and by making a one-sided declaration that Burma was annexed to the Empire of India. The political death of Burma occurred on 1 January 1886, but the event has been forgotten. The Boers, on the other hand, made a stir throughout the world. They got in touch with Germans, Irish, Americans, French, Dutch, and anybody else who might criticize Britain. They stated their case loudly and often. They waged commando warfare, adding the word commando to international military parlance, and sent small units deep into the British rear, setting off a mad uproar and making the world press go crazy with excitement. When they finally gave in, it was on reasonable terms for themselves. They left the British with an internationally blackened eye. Nobody remembered the Burmese. Everybody remembered the Boers. The Boers used every means they could think of. They did everything they could. They even captured Winston Churchill. These examples may show that the military role of propaganda and related operations is not as obscure or intangible as it may have seemed. It cannot be considered history, but must be regarded as a plea for the writing of history. More recent experience is another question, and involves tracing the doctrines pertaining to psychological warfare which have now become established military procedure in the modern armies. End of section 2.
Section 3 of Psychological Warfare. Chapter 2A. The Function of Psychological Warfare. Part 1. Psychological warfare, in the broad sense, consists of the application of parts of the science called psychology to the conduct of war. In the narrow sense, psychological warfare comprises the use of propaganda against an enemy, together with such military operational measures as may supplement the propaganda. Propaganda may be described in turn as organized persuasion by non-violent means. War itself may be considered to be, among other things, a violent form of persuasion. Thus, if an American fire raid burns up a Japanese city, the burning is calculated to dissuade the Japanese from further warfare by denying the Japanese further physical means of war and by simultaneously hurting them enough to cause surrender. If after the fire raid we drop leaflets telling them to surrender, the propaganda can be considered an extension of persuasion, less violent this time, and usually less effective, but nevertheless an integral part of the single process of making the enemy stop fighting. Neither warfare nor psychology is a new subject. Each is as old as man. Warfare, being the more practical and plain subject, has a far older written history. This is especially the case since much of what is now called psychology was formerly studied under the heading of religion, ethics, literature, politics, or medicine. Modern psychological warfare has become self-conscious in using modern scientific psychology as a tool. In World War II, the enemies of the United States were more fanatical than the people and leaders of the United States. The consequence was that the Americans could use and apply any expedient psychological weapon which either science or our version of common sense provided. We did not have to square it with emperor myths, the Führer principle, or some other rigid fanatical philosophy. The enemy enjoyed the positive advantage of having an indoctrinated people. We enjoyed the countervailing advantage of having skeptical people with no inward theology that hampered our propaganda operations. It is no negligible matter to be able to use the latest findings of psychological science in a swift, bold manner. The scientific nature of our psychology puts us ahead of opponents wrapped up in dogmatism, who must check their propaganda against such articles of faith as Aryan racialism or the Hegelian philosophy of history. Psychological warfare as a branch of psychology. Good propaganda can be conducted by persons with no knowledge of formal psychology. The human touch, the inventive mind, the forceful appeal, things such as these appear in the writings of gifted persons. Thomas Paine never read a word of Freud or Pavlov, yet Paine's arguments during the Revolutionary War played subtly on every appeal which a modern psychologist could catalog. But war cannot, in modern times, assume a statistical expectation of talent. Psychology makes it possible for the able but ordinary statesman or officer to calculate his persuasion systematically and to obtain by planning those results which greater men might hit upon by genius. What can psychology do for warfare? In the first place, the psychologist can bring to the attention of the soldier those elements of the human mind which are usually kept out of sight. He can show how to convert lust into resentment, individual resourcefulness into mass cowardice, friction into distrust, prejudice into fury. He does so by going down to the unconscious mind for his source materials. During World War II, the fact that Chinese babies remain unimpeded while they commit a nuisance, while Japanese babies are either intercepted or punished if they make a mess in the wrong place, was found to be of significant importance in planning psychological warfare. See below, page 154. In the second place, the psychologist can set up techniques for finding out how the enemy really does feel. Some of the worst blunders of history have arisen from miscalculation of the enemy's state of mind. By using the familiar statistical and questionnaire procedures, the psychologist can quiz a small cross-section of enemy prisoners, and from the results estimate the mentality of an entire enemy theater of war at a given period. If he does not have the prisoners handy, he can accomplish much the same end by an analysis of the news and propaganda which the enemy authorities transmit to their own troops and people. By establishing enemy opinion and morale factors, he can hazard a reasoned guess as to how the enemy troops will behave in specific conditions. In the third place, the psychologist can help the military psychological warfare operator by helping him maintain his sense of mission and of proportion. The deadliest danger of propaganda consists of it being issued by the propagandist for his own edification. This sterile and ineffectual amusement can disguise the complete failure of the propaganda and propaganda. There is a genuine pleasure in talking back, particularly to an enemy. The propagandist, especially in wartime, is apt to tell the enemy what he thinks of him, or to deride his weaknesses. But to have told the Nazis, for example, you Germans are a pack of murderous baboons, and your Hitler is a demented oaf, your women are slobs, your children are half-wits, your literature is gibberish, and your cooking is garbage, and so on, would have stiffened the German will to fight. The propagandist must tell the enemy those things which the enemy will heed. He must keep his private emotionalism out of the operation.